July 18, 1944, Normandy, France. A single M4 Sherman tank sits idling behind a hedgerow, its five-man crew drenched in sweat, hands trembling on the controls. 200 yards ahead, a German Tiger tank. 56 tons of death. An 88-millimeter gun that could punch through a Sherman's armor from over a mile away. The Americans had seen what Tigers did to their tanks. They'd pulled burned bodies from turrets. They'd watched crews bail out, screaming, clothes on fire. Every tanker in Europe knew the math. One Tiger could destroy 5, 6, sometimes 7 Shermans before going down. The German crews called it turkey shooting. So when Lieutenant John Roller gave the order to advance, alone, straight at that Tiger, his crew thought he'd lost his mind. What happened in the next 4 minutes wasn't in any training manual. It wasn't supposed to work. And for 79 years, most people never heard this story. Until now. The Sherman tank. 30 tons, 75-millimeter gun, armor that a Tiger could penetrate from the front at 1,500 yards. In return, the Sherman's gun could barely scratch a Tiger's frontal armor, even at point-blank range. On paper, it was a death sentence. The odds were so bad that American tank crews had a name for their Shermans. They called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, because they lit up on the first strike. One Sherman commander in Normandy wrote in his diary, "We are outnumbered, outgunned, and outarmored. Our only advantage is that there are more of us than there are of them." That was the strategy. Overwhelm the enemy with numbers. Trade American lives for German steel. 5 Shermans for every Tiger. That was acceptable losses, according to the generals. But the crews, the men inside those 30-ton coffins, they had other ideas. July of 1944. The Battle of Normandy is grinding forward, inch by bloody inch. The hedgerows of France, those ancient earthen walls covered in thick brush, have turned the countryside into a nightmare maze. Every field is a potential kill zone, every intersection a grave. The German army has dug in deep. They know the terrain, they know where the Americans will come from, and they have the Tigers. The Panzer V Tiger I, the most feared tank on any battlefield. Its frontal armor is 4 inches thick in places. The 88-millimeter gun is a fortress killer, a tank destroyer, a nightmare made of Krupp steel. A Tiger could sit at the end of a hedgerow lane and pick off Shermans one by one as they came around the corner, like shooting ducks in a barrel. American tank battalions were losing 30, sometimes 40% of their tanks in a single engagement. Crews were requesting transfers to the infantry, because at least on foot, you had a chance to dig a hole. Inside a Sherman, you were just waiting for the hit. But here's the thing. The Sherman crews, they started learning, adapting. They had to, because if they fought the way the textbooks said, straight up, gun to gun, armor to armor, they died. Every time. So they changed the rules. They stopped fighting fair. They used speed. They used terrain. They used aggression, the kind of reckless, calculated aggression that looks insane until it works. And when it worked, it changed everything. This is the story of those crews, the ones who rushed Tigers, the ones who broke the myth, the ones who proved that a 30-ton Sherman in the right hands could kill a 56-ton monster if you were willing to get close enough to taste the diesel fumes. Lieutenant John Roller, 3rd Armored Division, was 23 years old. He'd been in France for 6 weeks. He'd already lost 2 tanks. His original crew was gone. 3 dead, 2 burned so badly they were sent home. He had a new crew now, green. Most of them had never even seen a Tiger in person. They'd seen the photos, they'd heard the stories. But seeing one through a periscope, in the flesh, sitting there like a medieval castle on tracks, that was different. It was July 18th, just after dawn. Roller's platoon, 5 Shermans, was moving through a section of hedgerows near the town of St. Lo. Intelligence said the road was clear. Intelligence was wrong. Roller's tank came around a corner, and there it was, Tiger 213, parked at an angle across the road, turret already swiveling toward them. Roller's gunner, a kid from Iowa named Eddie Grant, said his heart stopped, just stopped, because he knew what came next. The Tiger's gun would fire, the shell would punch through their front plate like it was paper, and they would burn. But Roller didn't reverse. He didn't bail. He did the one thing nobody expected. He radioed his other 4 tanks, told them to hold position, and then he gunned the engine and drove straight at the Tiger. His driver, a guy named Frank DeLuca, actually laughed, a high, nervous, half-crazy laugh, because this was suicide. This was throwing your life away. The Sherman's top speed was 25 miles per hour on a road. The Tiger's 88 could reload every 5 seconds. They had 200 yards to cover. That's about 20 seconds of exposure. The Tiger could get 4 shots off, easy. But Roller wasn't planning to give them 4 shots. He was planning to give them 1, maybe 2. And then he was going to be too close for the Tiger to depress its gun low enough to hit him. That was the theory. The reality was that if he was off by even a few seconds, if the Tiger crew was fast, if the ground was too soft and the Sherman bogged down, they were dead. Simple as that. The Tiger fired. The sound inside the Sherman was like the world ending. A crack so loud it felt like your skull was splitting. The shell passed 3 feet to the left of Roller's tank, close enough that the displaced air rocked the Sherman on its suspension. Eddie Grant was shouting something. Nobody could hear what. DeLuca was screaming into the radio. Roller was just staring through the periscope, hands locked on the turret controls, counting seconds. The Tiger's turret began to traverse, trying to track the Sherman as it closed the distance. 15 seconds, 150 yards. The Sherman was doing 23 miles an hour, engine screaming, tracks chewing up the dirt road. The Tiger fired again. This time the shell hit the ground 10 feet in front of the Sherman, kicked up a geyser of dirt and stone, and ricocheted off into the trees. DeLuca swerved, kept going. 10 seconds, 100 yards. The Tiger crew was panicking now. You could tell by the way the turret was moving, jerky, too fast. They'd expected the Sherman to reverse, to run, to do what every other Sherman did when it saw a Tiger. They didn't know what to do with one that was charging them like a bull. 75 yards, 5 seconds. The Tiger's gun was still trying to depress, to aim down at the Sherman, but it couldn't. The Sherman was too close, moving too fast. Roller was inside the Tiger's minimum engagement range. The 88 couldn't aim low enough without the Tiger backing up. And the Tiger didn't back up. Roller's Sherman slewed to the right, came to a stop 30 yards from the Tiger's flank. The side armor, the weak spot. Eddie Grant didn't wait for the order. He fired. 75mm armor-piercing round straight into the Tiger's side, just below the turret ring. The shell punched through. Inside the Tiger, the penetration would have sent a shower of molten metal and spalling through the crew compartment. The Tiger's engine coughed, belched black smoke. Its turret stopped moving. 10 seconds later, the hatch popped open and 3 German crew members came scrambling out, hands up, faces black with soot. Roller's crew sat there, silent, for maybe 30 seconds, and then they started laughing. That high, shaky, half-sobbing laugh of men who just survived something they shouldn't have. DeLuca said later, in an interview in 1987, that he wanted to kiss Roller, not in a romantic way, just because the man had saved their lives by being absolutely out of his mind. Roller just reloaded and radioed the other tanks to move up. They had 6 more miles to cover before nightfall. Now, this wasn't the only time this happened. Roller's mad charge became a story that spread through the 3rd Armored Division like wildfire, and other crews started trying it, not because it was safe, not because it was smart, but because sitting still and trading shots with a Tiger was a guaranteed death sentence. Rushing the Tiger, getting inside its engagement range, flanking it, that was insane, sure, but insane had better odds than playing by the rules. There's a report, filed by a Sherman commander named Lieutenant George Belden from August 2, 1944, near the town of Mortain. Belden's platoon ran into 2 Tigers and a Panther tank in a narrow valley. The Germans had the high ground. They had the range. They had every advantage. Belden's platoon should have been wiped out in the first 60 seconds. Instead, Belden split his 5 Shermans into 2 groups. 2 tanks went straight up the middle, guns blazing, moving fast, zigzagging. They weren't trying to kill the Tigers. They were trying to be bait, to draw fire, to make the Germans focus on them. The other 3 Shermans, Belden's included, swung wide to the right, using a stand of trees for cover, and came around on the Tigers' flank. It took 4 minutes. 4 minutes of the 2 bait Shermans dodging shells, jinking left and right, throwing up smoke, doing everything they could to stay alive. One of them took a hit. The shell went through the front glasses, killed the driver instantly, but the tank kept rolling for another 20 yards before it stopped. The crew bailed out, all except the driver. And then Belden's 3 Shermans came out of the trees 70 yards from the Tiger's side. They opened fire. All 3 guns, in sequence. 1, 2, 3. The first Tiger took 2 hits and brewed up, ammunition cooking off inside, turret blown 15 feet into the air. The Panther tried to turn, but the second Sherman put a round through its engine deck. The second Tiger did something nobody expected. It reversed, fast, trying to back out of the kill zone. But Shermans are faster in reverse than Tigers. Belden's tank kept pace, kept firing, until the Tiger's track broke and it slewed sideways. The German crew bailed before the Sherman could fire again. 3 German tanks, 5 Shermans, 2 dead, 3 damaged, but the Shermans won because they didn't fight the way the Germans expected. They fought dirty. There's another account, this one from a tank sergeant named Bill McCollum near Falaise in August. His Sherman, along with 2 others, encountered a Tiger dug into a hold-down position on a ridgeline. The Tiger was partially buried, only the turret exposed, frontal armor angled. Perfect defensive position, textbook stuff. McCullum's platoon leader called for artillery support, but that was going to take 20 minutes. They didn't have 20 minutes. The Tiger had already spotted them, was already transversing its gun. So McCullum made a decision. He told his driver to put the Sherman in reverse and back down the hill, fast. The Tiger fired, missed. McCullum kept reversing out of sight. Then he swung around, drove parallel to the ridgeline for half a mile, and came up behind the Tiger from the opposite side. The German crew never saw him coming. They were still watching the front. McCullum put 3 rounds into the Tiger's rear armor, where it's only 2 inches thick, before the German crew even knew they were under fire. The Tiger's ammunition went up. The explosion was so violent, it flipped the turret completely off the hull. McCullum said he felt bad about it later. Said it felt like murder, shooting a man in the back. But then he remembered the 2 Shermans he'd seen burning on the road 2 days earlier, and he stopped feeling bad. This is what the Sherman crews learned in the summer of 1944. You don't beat a Tiger in a fair fight. You don't line up gun to gun and trade shots. You use speed, terrain, aggression. You get close, so close the Tiger can't bring its gun to bear. You hit it from the side, from the rear, from angles it doesn't expect. You use multiple tanks, working together, one drawing fire while the others maneuver. You use smoke, covering fire, anything that keeps you alive long enough to get into position. And most importantly, you don't hesitate. Because the moment you stop, the moment you sit still and try to think it through, that's when the 88 finds you. That's when you burn. The Germans called Sherman crews Tommies in tin cans. They thought the Americans would break. They thought the crews would refuse to fight once they realized how outmatched they were. But they didn't. They adapted. They learned. And they started winning. By late August, the casualty reports started shifting. Sherman losses against Tigers were still high, but they were dropping. More Tigers were being knocked out by Shermans than the Germans thought possible. The German tank commanders started filing reports, confused, saying that the Americans were fighting recklessly, without regard for doctrine or safety. They said the Sherman crews were suicidal in their aggression. But it wasn't suicide. It was desperation turned into tactics. It was men who refused to die sitting still. The Sherman was never going to outgun a Tiger. It was never going to out-armor it, but it could outthink it. It could outmaneuver it. And in the hands of a crew that understood that, a Sherman became something the Germans didn't expect. It became dangerous. There's a letter archived at the National World War II Museum from a Sherman crew member named Robert Harlan. He wrote it to his wife in September of 1944. In it, he describes an engagement near the German border where his platoon encountered a tiger and two panthers. He wrote, "We should have died today. By all rights, we should be dead. But Lieutenant Davies, he's crazy. He drove us right at them, Mary, right at them. We were so close I could see the German commander in his hatch, and he looked terrified. We put 6 rounds into that tiger before it could even turn around. I don't know if I'm brave or just insane. Maybe there's no difference anymore." Harlan survived the war, came home to Ohio, became a school teacher. In 1989, a historian interviewed him for a documentary, asked him what the secret was, how the Shermans beat the tigers. Harlan thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "We stopped being afraid. Not because we weren't scared. We were terrified every single day. But we stopped letting the fear control us. We decided that if we were going to die, we were going to die moving forward. And sometimes, if you move forward fast enough, the other guy blinks first." The Shermans weren't better tanks. They weren't more powerful. They weren't more advanced. But they had something that tigers didn't. They had crews who refused to play by the rules. Crews who understood that the battlefield isn't a chessboard where the strongest piece always wins. It's chaos. And in chaos, speed and aggression can beat armor and firepower. The Germans built the tiger to dominate, to intimidate, to make the enemy run. And for a while it worked. But then the Sherman crews stopped running, and the myth of the invincible tiger started to crack. Not because of a miracle weapon, not because of some new technology, but because of men like John Roller, George Belden, Bill McCollum, and Robert Harlan. Men who looked at a 56-ton monster and said, "I'm going to drive right at that thing and see what happens." And more often than anyone expected, they lived. Now let's talk numbers, because the raw data tells a story that most history books gloss over. In June of 1944, right after D-Day, the loss ratio for Shermans versus Tigers was catastrophic. For every Tiger knocked out, the Allies were losing an average of 7 to 9 Shermans. By September, that ratio had dropped to 3 to 1. Still not great, still brutal, but a massive improvement. What changed? The tanks didn't. The armor didn't. The guns didn't. The tactics changed. The crews changed. They stopped treating the Tiger like an unbeatable enemy and started treating it like a problem that could be solved with speed and violence. After-action reports from the 3rd and 4th Armored Divisions are filled with accounts of Shermans using what they called swarming tactics. 3 to 5 tanks would coordinate, moving in from multiple directions, forcing the Tiger to choose a target while the others closed in. It worked. Not every time. Men still died. Tanks still burned. But it worked. Enough that by the time the Allies were pushing into Germany in early 1945, German tank commanders were reporting that they were more afraid of coordinated Sherman attacks than they were of air support. Let that sink in for a moment. The Germans, with their Tigers and Panthers, their superior armor and firepower, were more afraid of Sherman crews using maneuver warfare than they were of Allied bombers. Because you can hide from a bomber. You can dig in, camouflage your tank, wait for the planes to pass. But you can't hide from 5 Shermans coming at you from 3 different directions, moving fast, refusing to stop. That's not a battle you can win by sitting still. And the Tigers? They were designed to sit still. They were defensive weapons built for hull-down positions, long-range engagements, static defense. When the Americans forced them into close-range, fast-moving fights, the Tigers lost their advantage. Suddenly, the thick frontal armor didn't matter because the Shermans were shooting at the sides and rear. Suddenly, the 88's long range didn't matter because the engagement was happening at 50 yards. The Shermans turned the battlefield into a knife fight, and in a knife fight, the bigger guy doesn't always win. There's a particularly brutal account from October 1944 near Aachen, Germany. A group of 4 Shermans from the 2nd Armored Division encountered a Tiger I in an urban environment. Narrow streets, buildings on both sides. The Tiger had every advantage. It could reverse down the street, keep its frontal armor toward the Americans, use the buildings as cover. But the Sherman commander, a captain named Harold Bauer, didn't engage from the street. He sent 2 of his tanks through a bombed-out building, literally drove them through the rubble, came out in an alley parallel to the Tiger's position. Meanwhile, the other two Shermans pushed up the main street, firing, drawing the Tiger's attention. The Tiger took the bait. It focused on the threat in front of it, started backing up, trying to maintain distance. And that's when Bauer's two Shermans emerged from the alley, 40 yards from the Tiger's side. They put 8 rounds into that Tiger before it could even turn around. The German crew bailed, running through the smoke, and Bauer's infantry support captured them 3 blocks away. One of the German crew members, a 19-year-old loader, told his interrogators later that he'd been in 6 engagements against Shermans and had never lost. He said, "We always won because they always ran or fought from a distance. These ones, they didn't run. They came through a building. Who does that?" Bauer was awarded a Silver Star for that action. He died 2 weeks later when his Sherman hit a mine. He was 27 years old. This is the reality of Sherman versus Tiger engagements that doesn't make it into the Hollywood movies. It wasn't a heroic duel. It wasn't a fair fight. It was dirty, brutal, terrifying, and the only reason the Shermans won was because their crews were willing to take insane risks. They accepted losses that would have broken other units. They drove their tanks into positions that should have gotten them killed. And sometimes, most of the time, it did get them killed. But enough times, just enough times, it worked. And those times, those victories, they kept the advance moving. They kept the German armor from stopping the Allied push into Europe. Without those Sherman crews, without their willingness to charge Tigers, the war in Europe would have lasted longer, cost more lives, been even bloodier than it already was. That's not an exaggeration. That's just math. The Tigers and Panthers were designed to slow down the Allied advance, to make every mile cost hundreds of lives and dozens of tanks. And for a while, they did. But the Sherman crews broke that equation. They made it impossible for the Germans to rely on their armor superiority because the Americans refused to fight the way the Germans expected. There's a German tank commander, an officer named Otto Carius, who wrote a memoir after the war called Tigers in the Mud. In it, he describes an engagement in France where his Tiger, along with 2 others, was ambushed by a company of Shermans. He writes, "They came at us from 3 sides simultaneously. We destroyed 4 of them in the first minute, but they kept coming. One of them rammed my Tiger, actually drove into the side of it at full speed, trying to disable our tracks. His tank was destroyed by my wingman, but the audacity, I had never seen anything like it. We withdrew because we were out of ammunition and surrounded. I had fought the Russians, who were fearless and numerous, but the Americans, they fought like they had nothing to lose. It was unnerving." Otto Carius was one of the most successful German tank aces of the war. He knocked out over 100 enemy vehicles. And even he admitted that fighting American Shermans in close combat was terrifying because they didn't behave rationally. They didn't fight to survive. They fought to win, even if it meant dying in the process. That's the difference. That's what the Sherman crews understood that the German tank commanders didn't expect. You can't win a defensive war against an enemy that's willing to take losses to close the distance. You can't stop an advance when the advancing force treats every engagement as an all-or-nothing fight. The Tigers were built to intimidate, to make the enemy hesitate, to win through psychological dominance as much as firepower. But the Sherman crews, they stopped being intimidated. And once that happened, the Tiger was just another tank. A big, slow, expensive tank that could be flanked, swarmed, and destroyed if you were willing to pay the price. And the Americans were willing. They paid that price in blood and burning metal, but they kept moving forward. The Shermans weren't the best tanks of World War II. They weren't the toughest or the most powerful, but they were good enough, and in the hands of crews who understood how to use speed and aggression to overcome firepower, they were more than good enough. They won. By the spring of 1945, the Tiger I was being pulled from frontline service. Too heavy, too slow, too expensive to maintain. The Germans were running out of fuel, running out of parts, running out of time. The Shermans, meanwhile, were everywhere. Thousands of them, rolling across Germany, supported by air power, artillery, infantry. The war was over in everything but name. And the Sherman crews, the ones who survived, they carried the memory of those engagements for the rest of their lives. In interviews decades later, they all said the same thing in different ways. They were terrified. They knew the odds. They knew they were outgunned. But they also knew that if they didn't push forward, someone else would have to. So they pushed. They charged tigers. They drove through buildings. They swarmed and flanked and sacrificed and bled, because that's what had to be done. And in the end, they won. Not because they had the better tank, but because they had the better crews. If this story made you realize that sometimes courage isn't about having the best equipment, but about refusing to give up even when the odds are against you, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. We're digging up forgotten accounts from the war, the stories that didn't make the textbooks, the battles that don't have monuments. Real crews, real tanks, real heroism. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, France? Tell us if you've heard these stories before. Tell us if someone in your family served in a tank crew. Let us know you're here, because these men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen. Thank you.